Hello everybody, back again, Geeks and Barbells, where we just talk about cool shit. Today is another BookTube episode. We're going to talk about my views on how someone should venture into the fantasy universe. Because, let's face it, there is a shit ton of books out there. And in regards to fantasy, I mean, one of the main reasons I love fantasy, it's what I grew up with, it's what has allowed me to actually expand into many other genres, which you don't really get if you're primarily growing up on other kinds of books. And fantasy is great because good fantasy, great fantasy, not all fantasy, but especially the major fantasy series are so large, so world encompassing that you kind of get a little bit of everything. You get poetry and art and literature, and you get talk about business and the world and political structures and character development, and you just get everything inside of a great fantasy book. But that can be very, very overwhelming for people who are not only not used to reading in general much of anything, but especially not large form books, especially not things with, we'll say, fantasy-esque themes. So where do you want to start off? A lot of people actually talk about Brandon Sanderson's books. Well, I am a huge Brander Sanderson. That would be kind of a nice name. Don't you think, Brander? Maybe it's just me. Anyway, Brandon Sanderson's books are really, really phenomenal. Stormlight Archives, his epic series, we will say, is probably, if not my favorite, and I'd have to put it in my top three. It really depends on where you're coming at in terms of style, but I love his Stormlight Archive series. That being said, many people love his Mistborn series. They consider it kind of the perfect kind of dip your toe into the fantasy world because it's got great character development, it's got a great world, a really interesting magic system, but it is kind of deep, it is kind of dark, and for people who aren't used to fantasy, it might be a little bit too weird. Because it's not high fantasy, it's kind of a, I guess you could call it dark fantasy. But I mean, I would definitely, if that kind of floats your boat, if you're more interested in more of a darker view of the world with a lot of political intrigue and those kind of concepts, and then a really complex but yet easy to understand magic system, the Mistborn series is fantastic. It is not one of my favorites. I like the first book. I did not get into the second and the third, and I have not read the continuation of the series. I believe they're at a trilogy now as well. I would go more, again, depending on what kind of concepts that you like, what kind of themes that you like. If you do like a more darker book, something a bit grittier, but to me that would mean, it depends. If you mean like a darker, more violent series, I do genuinely believe that David Gemmell is probably the best author for those kinds of fantasy series. His book, I believe it's called Echoes of the Great Song, actually, is a phenomenal kind of single standalone novel. It's about 300 pages or so. It's pretty small. It's a really fast-paced read. Like, David Gemmell is phenomenal at action fantasy. He's great at just this dark, gritty, throwing everything at you. Echoes of the Great Song is one of his best in terms of, it has a really nice, like, high fantasy feel to it, but it's got dystopian feels, kind of science fiction-y feels as well, and it's a great way to kind of jump into something just as a standalone book. If you're looking for more of a dark, mysterious kind of, magic is just around the corner, but you can never see it, never truly understand it. That kind of magic, a suspenseful thriller kind of magic, I think there's very few people who can do better than Neil Gaiman. His Graveyard Book is great for people who just want something a little more feels, a little bit more for younger children, but that still hits the feels for adults. His Graveyard Book is really great. If you want something more catering to adults, we'll say, is Neverwhere. It is one of my favorite novels as well. It's a small, short book, just like the Graveyard Book, and it is just phenomenal. It's just everything. It gives you just little tidbits of information without ever really telling you how things work, and he does it in a way that just makes you eat up the story. I would definitely check out the Neverwhere. If you're looking for more of a long form series, something you kind of sink your teeth into, that you can kind of build up and see a lot of character development and world development, but that is not too complicated, that really kind of gently introduces characters, gently introduces the magic system, layers on top of itself, starts off pretty, I will say, more for youth in the first novel, and then really, really builds up its steam as it goes. There's 6 books in the series. I would definitely go with, to start off with, The Furies of Calderon. So this is a book series from Jim Butcher. It's called the Codex Alera, the whole series. And he, as far as I'm concerned, he knocked it out of the park with this series. It's not perfect. It's not the most incredible series I've ever read, but for people who just want like a really great series that they can kind of go through and just really come to love the characters and love their development and see them grow up and learn so much, and just the enemies in it are, as far as I'm concerned, are phenomenal. They're so interesting. Jim Butcher did great. I mean, even the Dresden Files, his other really popular series, if you're looking for more of a modern day gritty fantasy, the Dresden Files are pretty easy to read. They're pretty short books. There's like 15 now. It's a gigantic series. So I think just Jim Butcher's work in general is a great way for people to start off. And his Codex Alera series and his Dresden Files series are really, really different. You know, one is more modern grit fantasy, and the other one has a lot of we can say high fantasy to a degree, but it's really kind of a mix because it pulls a lot from old Roman history in terms of combat and settings and everything. So that's really fascinating as well. For those kind of looking for something, I would say, really easy to read, super, super easy, you can never go wrong with either the Harry Potter series or the Percy Jackson series. Those are much more, we'll say, young adult, but they are famous for a reason. I mean, let's face it, they're much more for kids, the beginning of the series, but if you let yourself go through it, it's a really easy read. And once you start getting to book 3, 4, 5, 6, they both take off and they get pretty damn good. I have my own thoughts and complaints about each series in their own way, but I think for people who are just starting off, I would actually probably point them in the direction more of something like a Harry Potter or Percy Jackson. So long as you understand that, again, those are based in modern times, mixed in with like myth and fairy tales and all that kind of stuff, and kind of brought together. There are tons and tons of fantasy series that just have many, many different kinds of themes. And so for people who, let's say you start reading Harry Potter and you're like, oh, I don't like this kind of wands and wizards kind of style. There's 1,000 different other kinds of style of fantasy series. Some have no magic in them. Some have very little. Some where the magic barely takes part in it, and some where every part of the world and aspect is shaped by magic. So never let yourself kind of go down this path where you try one series or a standalone novel of fantasy or even science fiction, and then you don't get interested in it, and so you kind of like slap the entire genre with that kind of idea of how a book is going to be. Because let's say take something like the Stormlight Archives, and then you take something like Harry Potter, it's night and day. There's no comparison in terms of story, character development, how the magics work. Everything is completely different. You go on to something like Neverwhere, again, it's like a completely different style. So don't get caught up too much in how one series is. Don't be too harsh and too judgmental. If you don't like a series, move on to something else. There's lots of different styles. I would definitely say, if you like kind of fairy stuff and magical things and just a fun read, I do think the Artemis Fowl series are really cool. They just made not a TV series, a movie actually on Disney Plus, I believe. And I've heard some pretty good things. I haven't watched it yet, but the Artemis Fowl series is really fun if you just want to kind of have a fairy tale kind of story. And I'll end it off with, if you're looking for a deeper story. And this might be a bit weird because what I'm going to talk about is His Dark Materials from Philip Pullman. For anyone who hasn't read the series, it is one of the most fascinating series ever because you follow 2 main characters pretty much who are 12 years old. They're very young. and they act like young kids most of the time. Yet the overarching theme, the overarching story, the world building is on par with some, as far as I'm concerned, some of the best novels in the world. It delves into philosophy, religion, love, what it means to be human, spirits and death, and I can't even get into it. There's so much complexity to it, and Philip Pullman really did something magical with this series because he starts it off in a way and slowly progresses you into more and more deeper layered complexity as the series goes along. So in some ways you would think it's unacceptable to be talking about the topics he's talking with such young characters, yet it works. And the side characters, the characters who go along with Lyra and Will, who are the main characters, they are phenomenally done. You get to know the side characters really well without them overwhelming the children. The children always stay central focus, and it's their purity, it's their youth that actually helps the story progress. It helps it deal with these complex issues, because many times as adults, we overcomplicate things. We hyper overcomplicate things. And through Lyra and through Will, we get to see this real purity and them dealing with these hyper complex issues that are kind of exploding into the world of his dark material. So I would definitely recommend that if you're someone who's looking to really have something a little bit more deep. And that's about it. I mean, if you start with any of those series, you'll kind of touch upon all the different style themes that you can kind of see in fantasy. There's still many more out there, and obviously people take and pick and choose different themes and genres and tropes and mush them all together into new and fascinating ways. That's what makes books in general really amazing. That's what makes fantasy so fun, because there's just so many ways to spin out a story with fantasy. And I would definitely recommend trying those out. I'm sure people will think of dozens more that are great to start with. I'm sure there are people who disagree with some of my choices, and I would like to know. Let me know down below in the comments. Like, subscribe, check out the old website at GeeksnBarbells, and I am heading out. Enjoy your day, young ladies and gents.